I'd like to introduce our next speaker now, who is Shohel Chandra Hajang. Shohel belongs to the Hajang community in Bangladesh, and seeing the injustice and discrimination in his community and the injustices that they faced, he decided to work for an organization which advocates for Indigenous peoples in this area, human rights. Shohel is a human rights program officer at AIPP, Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, and coordinator for the Indigenous Navigator there. He works with a wide range of Asian indigenous communities who are living in Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Thailand, Malaysia, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Timor-Leste, Taiwan, and Japan. Shohel assists indigenous peoples to engage with human rights mechanisms and processes at the national, regional, and international levels, including finalizing and submitting communications and petitions to relevant human rights mechanisms. Shohel, we're very excited to have you today, and we're very much looking forward to hearing your intervention.
Thank you, David. Please allow me to share my screen first.
Yes, if you can try now, you should be able to. Here it's coming on. Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, thank you, David, and thank you everyone for this opportunity. Now I want to share my presentation on current barriers to participation in free, prior, informed consent and how to overcome them, including a focus on Indigenous women. So in my presentation, I will try to cover some agendas like AIPP and its activities, Indigenous Navigator activities, and what is the FPIC situation in Asia and current barriers, and also how to overcome these barriers. So this is Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact. It is one biggest organizations, indigenous organization in Asia, established in 1992 by Indigenous Peoples Movement, and it works with 46 member organizations in 14 countries, and it has 6 programs in the different specific thematic areas, and it has 5 regional networks. And AIPP, as a consortium partner, implemented the first phase of Indigenous Navigator project in 3 countries, Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Nepal, and it has a lot of significant achievements like Indigenous peoples communities data collection, and strengthening the relationship between Indigenous peoples and government bodies and other stakeholders, and making SDGs for Indigenous peoples, and access to public social security funds. So this is FPIC. I think we are aware about this FPIC. It is an important mechanism whereby Indigenous peoples are able to conduct their own independent collective decision making on matters affecting them. Free, prior, informed consent. So free is no pressure. It is fully independently they will take decision. Prior is the consent, what is earlier they need to provide and need to give the consent before the specified activity is authorized. Inform is must. It need to inform with the full and accurate information. And consent is collective and independent decision of community, Indigenous communities. And we know we have a lot of international instruments that address this free, prior, informed consent and recognize this for Indigenous peoples. We can say UNDP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and ILO Convention 169, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and we have other instruments and also international financial instruments who address these FPIC issues. And this is the FPIC situation in Asian countries where we are working for. So, so what is the present condition now? If we tell, we have a lot of international instruments, and we have UNGP, United Nations guiding principle on BHR and others documents, but how the FPIC process is followed in the countries. So this is the main concern. But we have seen that no proper utilization, no proper following up of FPIC process among indigenous peoples. And also we can see that when corporate comes in the name of development, actually then we have seen that they are violating indigenous people's rights, and they are extracting and exploiting the resource of indigenous peoples. And another important point is that is the indigenous peoples across the Asia, we have seen that are increasingly subjected to criminalizations. The indigenous peoples who are raising their voice on their rights, and sometimes it is not favored in the government or other important bodies, but we have seen that our indigenous peoples, they are facing many threats, killing, and also they have been criminalized. And it is important thing that in this FPIC process, we are seeing that indigenous women, they are very absent here. And we have seen in Asian countries, many government and CSOs also don't understand properly the FPIC process. They are confusing to take any decision and how to following this FPIC process like that. That's why we have seen much less obtaining IP's consent before proceeding this kind of project. And I want to show some cases here because of time limitations. Just this is one case from Bangladesh Madhupur forest area. So forest department is planning to dig a artificial lake in their ancestor area. Then the local indigenous peoples, they are protesting this initiative. And this is the case from Chittagong Hill Treks of Bangladesh. Actually, one 5-star Marriott hotel is constructing there, evicting the local Mro indigenous peoples. And we have seen a lot of advocacy, lobby, and campaign of local indigenous peoples, and also AAPP and IBGA and other organizations for these cases. And these cases we have taken from Nepal. This is World Bank and ADB finance 2 projects what are implementing in Nepal without following any free prior informed consent of local indigenous peoples. And this is the important case from Thailand. So we have seen that last year, the World Heritage Committees have taken a dangerous precedent, dangerous example on the declaration of King Krachan Forest Complex in Thailand. This regarding severe cases of reported human rights violations and history of the current indigenous peoples in Thailand. And this is one cases from plainland of Bangladesh. This is Bagda Farm area, where 5 years ago, the sugar mill authority and the security person evicted the local Santal indigenous peoples, and they have made fire on their houses and killed 3 people. And now again, the government is planning to set up a largest export processing zone in this area. So now the question is, what is the barrier actually to participate in this FPIC process? So we can say that the lack of a national legislation recognizing indigenous peoples, because we have international instrument, but lack of the national policy and legislations, the FPIC is not implemented in the countries. And also indigenous peoples, their customary laws and self-determination, self-government system also not respected and recognized at the country level. And still indigenous people's capacities are not so strong to fight, to deal these cases, and no actually proper guideline or strategy what indigenous people will follow at the local level to deal this case. And a lack of access to adequate data information, we have facing these problems. And this is actually very important barriers focusing on indigenous women. We see The indigenous women is also a marginalized group among indigenous peoples, but they are left behind, mostly left behind in the FPIC process. And also we have seen that they are not actually benefited because all the benefits and compensations go to men, but indigenous women, they are facing a lot of problems with increasing their workload, lack of their technical knowledge and advocacy skills. Also they are not fit to deal this kind of FPIC process. And also we have seen that women's security issue is important because indigenous women are still facing the violence against indigenous peoples, a lot of cases in Asian countries. And when this kind of project come, we have seen that the tourism or project area can bring increased alcohol, sex workers, and violence into them. Now the question is how to overcome the barriers. So to overcome these barriers, I have some recommendations to different stakeholders. So I have recommendations to indigenous people and CSO, recommendation to state, recommendation to financial institutions. So for the indigenous peoples, actually, we need to work for an effective strategy to follow how we can follow this strategy and deal this kind of business and human rights issues. And we need to strengthen actually in community people's capacity. We need to generate the data. It is very important, and Indigenous Navigator project is doing that. And also analytical skill, and need to translate and localize our FPIC documents and guiding principles as well. And for the state, actually state can play a great role. No, state can ratify the ILO Convention 169 and UN declarations, also the UN guiding principles, and they can enact their own legislation, action plan, what will be important for the indigenous peoples to implement this FPIC process. And also indigenous territories, their self-determination, their customary laws need to be respected and recognized by the country and state. So recommendation for the corporate sector. So it is also very important, the corporate sector, because they invest a lot of money for this. Corporations should commit to respect international standard of indigenous peoples, and corporations need to adopt the policies which clarify their human rights obligations under international standards, irrespective of national legislation, and engage in comprehensive dialogue between indigenous peoples and the company people. And lastly, act on human rights due diligence assessment. It is also need to consider by the companies. So these recommendations for these three specific stakeholders, but we have other mechanism like UN mechanism, Indigenous Navigator, international development agencies. So we can help to take a necessary initiative to implement this for the indigenous peoples. So this was the presentation. Thanks all.